Okay, is it okay? So now we'll learn about the topic called lateral ventricle. Earlier we learned about the ventricular system and the third ventricle. Now we are going to the lateral ventricle, which is the largest ventricle in the ventricular system, and also spatially a little bit complex because of its relations. It has a lot of structures that are related to it, which can be a little confusing for students. So let us have an overview about this first, and then we will have a look at the AnaView tool to understand its spatial anatomy. Okay, first as I mentioned before, the NMC mentions that AN 63.1 mentions that you need to demonstrate and describe the parts, boundaries and features of the third, fourth and the lateral ventricle, and of this lateral ventricle is kind of complex among all of these three ventricles. So this is a image of the lateral ventricle that you are seeing here. In the lateral ventricle, you will be asked what are the parts of the lateral ventricle. Okay, the parts are, this is the anterior horn. Okay, this is called the anterior horn. Anterior horn is also called as the frontal horn. Okay, the reason is that the anterior horn is actually, as you know, it is anterior and it is located in the frontal lobe. It is extending into the frontal lobe, so you can also call it as the frontal horn. Then the anterior horn continues on to this segment. This segment is called as the body. The body is actually located in the parietal lobe. The anterior horn, I told you, it is in the frontal lobe. The body is located in the parietal lobe. And then you have the posterior horn. The posterior horn is located inside the occipital lobe. Okay, occipital lobe. So posterior horn, you can also call it as the occipital horn. Okay, occipital horn. Alright, now next you have the inferior horn. The inferior horn extends into the temporal lobe, and that's why inferior horn is also called as the temporal horn. Okay, now going by this terminology, actually the body is located inside the parietal lobe, but you don't call it related to the parietal lobe. But the other three horns, the anterior horn is called frontal horn, posterior horn is called occipital horn, and the inferior horn is also called temporal horn. And you can see the C-shaped outline, okay, C-shaped outline that is characteristic of the lateral ventricle with the horn backwards. Okay, this C-shaped outline is parallel with all the C-shaped structures that you see in the neuroanatomy that you learn, because in the cerebrum also you know that there is a frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe and a temporal lobe, which is again forming a C. So this is roughly parallel with that C-shaped formation. Now let us look at this classic Gray's anatomy picture, and in this Gray's anatomy picture you are seeing that the frontal horn is located inside the frontal lobe, right? This much part, since this is a central sulcus, this much part will be the frontal lobe. Okay, so it is the frontal horn is located inside the frontal lobe. The body is located inside the parietal lobe, and you can see that the occipital horn is located inside the occipital horn is located inside the occipital lobe, and the temporal horn is located inside the temporal lobe. So you can see that same C-shaped arrangement, and you can correlate with where the ventricle is located within the brain. Okay, now let us have a sectional view of the brain. This is a complicated dissection, but this is showing what are the structures, very important nuclear groups that are related to the lateral ventricle when you do this kind of a complicated dissection in the brain to expose the relations of the lateral ventricle. So let me just get you oriented to this picture. Here what you are seeing is you are exposing the lateral ventricle from above. Okay, you have removed the roof of the lateral ventricle. Okay, the roof of the lateral ventricle had corpus callosum, so the rest of the corpus callosum is removed in this. And here you are seeing the inferior horn. What you are seeing here is the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. So from the anterior horn to the body into the inferior horn, that much part is dissected out and it is viewed from above in this dissection. So in this dissection you can see that this is the floor, what you see here, this much part, this is the floor of the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. Okay, there you can see two bulges. I want you to locate at these two bulges. This bulge is the head of the caudate nucleus, very important, caudate nucleus head. I didn't mention that in the PPT, it is head of the caudate nucleus. That is the big bulge that you see in the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. And if you look more towards the body of the lateral ventricle, you can see that here you have another nucleus. This nucleus is the thalamus, which we learned when we learned about the third ventricle. Between the two thalami you had the third ventricle. So that is the thalamus. So this egg-shaped structure that you see here, that is the thalamus. Okay, this is the thalamus. So over the thalamus you are having the caudate nucleus. Caudate nucleus will be related over the thalamus. See, it is almost like this. You have an egg-shaped thalamus over here, and over that you have the caudate-shaped nucleus. Nucleus over. It is like the head is anterior and it is encircling it from above and backwards. Okay, that is how the caudate and thalamus are related, and both of them are related from the lateral ventricle. If you look at the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle, which is almost here, you have the bulge of the head of the caudate. If you look at the body of the lateral ventricle, you have the body of the caudate, which is here, and the superior surface of the thalamus, which is over here. Okay, these are the relations of the floor of the lateral ventricle in the anterior horn and in the body. Okay, now if you look at the inferior horn, you can see another structure. Okay, so I mentioned about the caudate and about the thalamus. Now if you look at the inferior horn in the floor, you can see this structure. Okay, I want you to have a look at this structure, which almost look like the the paws of a lion or a paws of a cat. Okay, it looks almost like that, and that is called the hippocampus. This structure is called the hippocampus. Hippocampus is very important in the memory circuit. It is one of the very important stations in the limbic circuitry, which is important in converting short-term memory to long-term memory. So that structure is located in the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. That is what you are seeing here. Okay, what I am shading now is the hippocampus, which is located in the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. Okay, so the three structures I have mentioned now are the caudate head here and the body backwards. Then you have the thalamus and the hippocampus. The caudate head is located in the anterior horn. The body of the caudate and the thalamus superior surface is located in the body of the lateral ventricle, and in the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle you have the hippocampus. Okay, these three structures are very important nuclear groups that are located in relation to the lateral ventricle. Now let us have a look at this in a coronal section. In the coronal section also you need to understand this same thing, which is very important because you will be seeing most of the anatomy in scans in your practice. So let us have a look at this coronal section. As you know, coronal section means it goes like this. Okay, it cuts, the image that you see here is a cut image that occurs when you cut the brain like this. Okay, what you are seeing here is the lateral ventricle. What I am marking here is the lateral ventricle body. Okay, this is the body of the lateral ventricle. So if you look at the body of the lateral ventricle and you look at the lower surface, you can see this nuclear group. Can you see that nuclear group, gray matter? Okay, gray matter, that nuclear group is called the head of the body of the caudate. That is called the body of the caudate. And if you look here, this is the thalamus. This is the thalamus. So on the floor of the lateral ventricle, you see the body of the caudate laterally and you see the superior surface of the thalamus medially. You should also recall that the thalamus was forming a boundary of the third ventricle, which you are seeing here. What you are seeing here is the third ventricle. What I am shading here with red, that is the third ventricle. So third ventricle, when we learned about the third ventricle, I mentioned that the third ventricle lateral surface had thalamus. So thalamus has a dual relation. Thalamus is related to the third ventricle medially and it is related to the body of the lateral ventricle superiorly. That is the relation what you are seeing here. The third ventricle is located medially and the body of the lateral ventricle is located superiorly. That is what you are seeing in that image. So you saw the caudate, you saw the thalamus. Next, this what you see here is the section of the inferior horn, coronal section of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. And when you see the coronal section of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, you know earlier in the dissection you saw that the inferior horn contained the hippocampus in the lower end, in the floor. So that hippocampus is what you are seeing here. This is that hippocampus. Hippocampus is a very, very important structure, as I told before. It's very important in memory circuitry. It is one of the stations of the brain, one of the nuclear groups of the brain that is affected in Alzheimer's disease. So for all of this, hippocampus is very important, and its relation of the inferior horn is also very important. If you have a hippocampal atrophy, the volume of the CSF inside the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle will be larger. So all of this has very enormous importance in neuroanatomy. So that is hippocampus, and hippocampus, as you can see, is related lower as in the floor of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. Okay. So you can again see the caudate. I've already annotated it. I'll mark it again. This is the caudate, and this is the thalamus. Caudate and thalamus is forming the floor of the lateral ventricle. Thalamus is also forming the lateral wall of the third ventricle, and the hippocampus is located in the floor of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. You should also note this structure, okay, because this is a very, very important region. This structure is the putamen. Okay, this is the putamen, and this is called the globus pallidus. Together it is called lentiform nucleus. You should notice that the lentiform nucleus is not related to the lateral ventricle. See, that is not related to the lateral ventricle, but the putamen is separated by the caudate nucleus by this fiber tract. This fiber tract is called the internal capsule. Very, very important pathway that is present inside the brain. In the core of the brain is the internal capsule. And see, the internal capsule or the lentiform nucleus is not related to the lateral ventricle. Lateral ventricle is related only to the caudate and the thalamus. Okay, but the putamen and the globus pallidus, the lentiform nucleus, is separated from the caudate and the thalamus by the internal capsule. This relation is extremely important. Okay, with that idea, let us have a look at the tool, AnaView 3D tool, where we can appreciate this 3D anatomy in a different perspective. Okay, we are continuing. Now we are seeing this lateral ventricle and this important nuclear groups in this 3D anatomy tool, where we will try to visualize these structures. Okay, this is the I'll look at the superior inferior view. Yeah, this is a superior inferior view. I am zooming in. You are looking at the lateral ventricle from above. Okay. Now I am turning it on the side and looking at from the left right view, from a lateral view. You can see the C-shaped lateral ventricle outline. I'll move this planes to make it very clear. Okay, C-shaped lateral ventricle outline. This is the frontal horn. This will be the body of the lateral ventricle. This will be the posterior horn. This will be the inferior horn. And I forgot to mention that in the previous video, in the previous segment, that in between the body, the place where the body of the lateral ventricle, the inferior horn and the posterior horn meets, that region is called the atrium of the lateral ventricle. Atrium. It is a large area where these three three parts of the lateral ventricle is coming and meeting. So this trigonal area is called the atrium of the lateral ventricle. Okay, now again, as we mentioned before in the overview section, that the lateral ventricle is connected, is communicated with the, I'll just move this plane backwards. Yeah, it is communicated with the third ventricle through, it is communicated with the third ventricle through the interventricular foramen. You can see the interventricular foramen here. Okay, so we understood the parts of the lateral ventricle and how it appears in different sections. For example, you can see the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle in the occipital lobe in this section. Can you see that? This is the same structure. What you see here as black is the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle. Okay. So as we move forwards, you can see the lateral ventricle getting larger. Now you are in the atrium. Now I am moving forwards and you can see the body above, and as I move downwards you can see the inferior horn here, and the body will be located here. Okay, this is the body of the lateral ventricle. I am moving more anteriorly. You can see the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. This is the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. All of these we saw in the coronal section. Okay, it's very clear. You can see the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle here. Going backwards, you can see the body of the lateral ventricle now. Going backwards, you can now see the atrium. Going backwards, you can now see the occipital horn. Okay, so you can correlate what you learned in the lateral projection with what you see in a coronal section. Okay, it's very easy now. Now let us have a look at that nuclear groups relations. I told you that is very important. So this tool gives us the flexibility to check this nuclear groups. For example, I am going to add left caudate here. I am going to add left putamen here. I am going to add right caudate let me just find out, yeah, right caudate and the right putamen. So I have marked caudate and putamens here, and you can see how the caudate bulge is located here, and the caudate bulge is related to the head of the caudate bulge is related to the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. Let us just confirm that by moving this coronal section anteriorly. Okay, move this coronal section anteriorly. Look, the caudate is what is shown as blue. It is very small in size if you look at this image. Now as I move more and more anteriorly, it is increasing in size because the caudate is getting its bulged anterior part, and now it is becoming the head of the caudate. See how much large the head of the caudate is. Now that head of the caudate is creating an indentation on the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. So the question usually asked is, what is the inferolateral relation of the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle? It is the head of the caudate. Now notice how the putamen is away from the caudate. It is not near the caudate, and it is also near the lateral ventricle, also not near the lateral ventricle. It is away from the lateral ventricle, and you can see a gap over here between the putamen and the caudate. That is where the internal capsule will descend down. I can show that in this section image also. You can see the caudate over there, the blue. This is the putamen. Between that you can see the internal capsule. So the internal capsule is not related to the lateral ventricle. The lateral ventricle anterior horn is having this profile, this shape, because of the bulge of the head of the caudate. So that relation is very clear now. Now I am just adding the left and the right thalamus. I am adding the left thalamus here. I am adding the right thalamus here. The thalamus, let us have a look at the thalamus. Yes, this is the thalamus. Look at the thalamus now. The thalamus is having a green color in this segmented image. Look how the thalamus is related. Let me just orient it in an anterior-posterior view. Yeah, in this view, can I orient it? Now just have a look how the two thalami are very close together. In between that you can see the slit shaped third ventricle, which was described before, and you can see how the body of the lateral ventricle, this is the body of the lateral ventricle, inferiorly it is related to the body of the caudate laterally and the thalamus superior surface medially. So did you understand the dual relation of the thalamus? The thalamus is related superiorly with the body of the lateral ventricle and medially with the third ventricle. So this orientation is very clear in this imaging. Okay, now let us move this section image in a more posterior plane. You see very clearly, you can see that correlate what we learned earlier in that atlas picture. See the lateral ventricle, when a lateral ventricle section, you can see the caudate occupying more lateral position and the thalamus occupying more medial position in the floor of the lateral ventricle. So that relation is very clear, and see very carefully how the putamen is away from the lateral ventricle. Putamen and globus pallidus, or the lentiform nucleus, is away from the lateral ventricle, and that is separated from the caudate and the thalamus by the internal capsule. This is a very, very critical area for a basic doctor to understand, to interpret scans, because this is a region where you can have a lot of strokes. Strokes in the internal capsule, ganglion capsulonic region is very important. Its anatomy is very important, so this spatial understanding is very, very critical. Now let us have a look at the hippocampus also. We mentioned about this basal ganglionic structures, the caudate, putamen, as well as thalamus. Now let us also add the hippocampus, and let us have a look how the hippocampus is related there. I am adding the right hippocampus here, and I am adding the left hippocampus here. Hippocampus is color coded as yellow here, okay, as yellow here. Now please get oriented. You are seeing putamen as blue, I mean the caudate nucleus as blue, the thalamus as the green one, the putamen is pink, and this is the hippocampus. Hippocampus is located in the inferior relation of the inferior horn. Okay, inferior horn. I will just make this clear by unchecking all the others, and I will just show the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle along with the hippocampus. Okay, along with the hippocampus. To make this clear, I will just move this image. Okay, this is a coronal section. This is a very, very common imaging that is done in dementia workup, in understanding hippocampal volume, in understanding hippocampal atrophy, also in hippocampal sclerosis. This is a very common imaging area that is focused for all of these purposes. So, let me just focus on this area, okay, on this area and move. Can you see the hippocampus over here, the yellow colored one, and above that the black colored structure is the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. So, we have understood how the very important nuclear groups are related to the lateral ventricle, not only the lateral ventricle anatomy, but also the relations of the lateral ventricle, especially the thalamus, the caudate and the hippocampus related to the lateral ventricle. Okay. This much structures have been dealt very beautifully with this tool.